The elevator doors opened onto the entrance of the Belvedere, and Michelle smoothed the fabric of her fitted black dress as classical piano drifted through the marble lobby. 3 months. That's how long it had been since she discovered the truth about what Scott had done to her credit, and tonight was the first time she felt like she might actually survive it. Tonight wasn't optional. Her last investor meeting. The only chance to save her jewelry design business before the creditors Scott had left her with swallowed everything she'd built. Real funding. The kind she'd worked toward since launching her studio 2 years ago, before Scott had systematically destroyed her financial reputation along with her ability to trust her own judgment. The bar's interior radiated wealth and exclusivity, all burgundy leather and gold chandeliers that made her mounting anxiety feel like it belonged to someone else's life. Private booths curved along the perimeter, and an imposing bar dominated the center, crystal glassware arranged like crown jewels. It wasn't her world anymore, but she needed these people to believe it was. One night of pretending she hadn't spent the morning dodging collection calls. She claimed a seat at a high top near the edge of the main floor, ordered a glass of Bordeaux, and checked her phone for the message from her business partner, Adriana. She'd been Michelle's anchor through the financial collapse, working without pay, reminding her that rebuilding was possible even when the debt made her want to disappear. Investor confirmed. 9 p.m. sharp. You've got this. Just be yourself. Her response was quick. Being myself is what got me into this mess. Tonight, I'm being someone who has her life together. The wine arrived, dark and gleaming in the soft light. Michelle lifted it carefully, inhaling the rich aroma before taking that first sip, letting the warmth settle her nerves. That's when she saw him. Scott stood near the coat check, water spots on his gray suit jacket, scanning the crowd with that corporate intensity she used to mistake for ambition. Her chest tightened. This couldn't be chance. The Belvedere was nowhere near his office, completely outside his usual circuit of sports bars and chain restaurants. He'd found out about tonight somehow, or worse, he'd been monitoring her calendar. Their eyes locked across the elegant space. His expression shifted immediately, rearranging itself from whatever calculation he'd been running into that rehearsed mask of gentle concern. He moved toward her table, and she considered fleeing. But leaving would mean abandoning the investor meeting, losing this last opportunity, and he'd just corner her somewhere more isolated. At least here there were witnesses. Wealthy, connected witnesses. Michelle. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking. I heard you were meeting someone here tonight.
You shouldn't be here, Scott.
We have nothing to discuss. I disagree. His voice carried that familiar edge of wounded righteousness. You destroyed my reputation over a misunderstanding. You owe me a conversation at minimum. Every nerve in her body screamed to walk away. But something defiant pushed back, some need to prove she could handle him now, that she'd learned to see through his manipulations. 5 minutes. You say whatever you think you need to say, and then you disappear from my life. Permanently. He signaled for the bartender, ordered a whiskey. When it arrived, he settled into his chair like they were old colleagues reconciling instead of what they actually were. A woman trying to escape and the man who'd sabotaged her future because she dared to leave. Michelle was only half listening to his rehearsed justifications when she became aware of something shifting in the room. Not the ambient noise of conversation, but a sudden quality of attention that made her skin prickle. In a corner booth, partially obscured by a marble pillar, sat 3 men in dark suits. Papers spread before them, voices low and serious. But one of them, the one who radiated authority even while motionless, had his complete attention fixed on their table. On Scott's hands. He was formidable in a way that made her pulse spike. Dark hair slicked back with precision, sharp features, expensive black suit with an open white collar and a thick gold chain catching the light. But it was his eyes that held her. cold, piercing, and utterly focused. Not on her. On the glass Scott was now lifting from the bartender's tray. She looked away, heat flooding her face. Scott was still talking, oblivious to everything except his own narrative. "I need to think," Michelle said abruptly, cutting through his explanation. "Just give me a minute." She stood and moved toward the restroom corridor, needing distance, needing to clear her head. Maybe she could text Adriana, ask her to call with a fake emergency. Anything to end this encounter before her investor arrived and saw her with Scott. The restroom was blessedly empty. She gripped the marble counter, staring at her reflection. Her makeup was flawless, but her eyes betrayed her, tired, frightened, trapped. What was she doing? She should have called security the moment Scott appeared. She reapplied her lipstick with shaking hands, forced 3 slow breaths, and returned to face whatever came next. The atmosphere had transformed. She felt it immediately. Conversations hadn't stopped, but they'd shifted, becoming background noise to something far more compelling happening near her table. Scott sat rigid in his chair, his corporate composure fracturing. But standing directly beside her empty seat, holding her wine glass between 2 fingers like evidence, was the man who'd been watching from the corner booth. Up close, he was overwhelming. Tall, powerfully built, with the kind of controlled stillness that suggested violence was always an option he was choosing not to employ. His expression revealed nothing, but his presence demanded answers. The 2 other men from his booth had repositioned themselves. One near the bar, shoulders square and ready. Another by the main entrance, casual but clearly blocking the exit. Whatever was unfolding had been orchestrated with absolute precision. Michelle approached slowly, confusion colliding with a primal instinct that she'd just stepped into something far more dangerous than Scott's manipulation. Before we dive deeper into this story, take a moment to hit that like button if you love suspenseful, emotional stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling chapter. We also want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Whether it's your city, your country, or even just your favorite spot to watch these stories, we love connecting with our global audience. Now let's get back to the story and see just how far courage can take someone when danger is closing in. The investor was late. Michelle checked her phone for the 3rd time in as many minutes, then forced herself to set it face down on the table. Appearing desperate wouldn't help. Neither would the slight tremor in her hands that she couldn't quite control. She tried to focus on the room, on the easy laughter from the booth behind her, on the bartender's graceful movements as he mixed something elaborate for a woman in diamonds. This was supposed to be her world once. Before Scott had systematically opened credit cards in her name, racked up $60,000 in debt, and vanished from her apartment while she was presenting at a trade show in Milan. Before the collections agencies started calling. Before her studio's operating account was frozen and her manufacturer in Thailand stopped returning her emails. The memory of finding those bills still made her nauseous. His name nowhere on the accounts. Just hers. And when she'd finally tracked him down, when she'd confronted him with printouts and lawyers' letters, he'd looked at her with those wounded eyes and said, "I was going to tell you. I was trying to fix it first. I thought you'd understand." Understanding hadn't saved her business. The banks didn't care that she'd been defrauded by someone she'd trusted. They just wanted their money. Movement in her peripheral vision pulled her back to the present. Scott was standing now, weaving through the scattered tables with that careful precision he used when he'd had just enough whiskey to feel bold. He carried 2 wine glasses, deep red, expensive-looking. His expression had shifted again, less wounded now, more earnest. Rehearsed earnestness. "Michelle, please." He set 1 glass in front of her, kept the other. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I need you to understand what happened. what I've been dealing with." She stared at the wine like it might bite her. "I don't want anything from you, Scott. It's just wine. A peace offering." He slid into the seat across from her, uninvited, inevitable. "I've been in therapy. Real therapy, not just the court-mandated stuff. I'm starting to understand how my father's bankruptcy affected my relationship with money, with control. I never meant to hurt you. I was drowning and I grabbed onto the nearest lifeline without thinking about what it would cost you." The words flowed like he'd practiced them. Maybe he had. Maybe his therapist had helped him craft the script, taught him how to weaponize vulnerability. Michelle felt the old instinct rising, the urge to comfort him, to make his pain smaller even as hers remained vast and unresolved. "I'm meeting someone," she said quietly. "You need to leave. Just hear me out. 5 minutes." He pushed the wine glass closer to her. "I'm trying to make amends. I've started a payment plan with the creditors. It's not enough, I know that, but I'm trying. I need you to know I'm trying." The glass sat between them, dark and gleaming. Michelle's own wine had gone warm, forgotten. She could smell the Bordeaux he'd brought, richer, more complex than what she'd ordered for herself. An expensive vintage. The kind of gesture Scott always made when he was building toward something. Her phone lit up with a text. The investor, apologizing, running 15 minutes behind. 15 more minutes trapped here with Scott and his performance of redemption. She reached for the wine glass he'd brought, not because she wanted it, but because holding something gave her hands purpose. Because refusing felt like letting him see how much power he still had to unsettle her. His smile was small, satisfied, like she'd just passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. Vito Moretti had learned long ago that power wasn't about speaking. It was about seeing what others missed while they were busy performing their own importance. The contract spread across the booth before him was simple. Territory rights, distribution percentages, the usual dance of numbers that meant life or death, depending on who signed where. Marco sat to his left, pen hovering over the signature line, trying not to let his nervousness show. To his right, Luca reviewed the terms one final time, his lawyer's mind catching details that would matter in 6 months when memories got selective. Vito wasn't looking at the contract. His attention had snagged on the woman near the window 30 seconds after she'd walked in. Not because she was beautiful, though she was elegant in that black dress, moving through the space like she was trying to convince herself she belonged here. No. What caught him was the tension in her shoulders, the way she'd checked her phone 3 times before her wine arrived, the subtle tells of someone running on borrowed time and diminishing options. He recognized desperation. He'd built an empire on understanding exactly how it looked. "The percentages are acceptable," Marco said, his voice pulling Vito's attention back. "But the timeline concerns me. 6 months is aggressive. 6 months is what you have." Vito's tone allowed no negotiation. "You wanted territory, I'm giving it to you. But I don't wait for people to figure out how to do what they promised." Marco nodded, chastened. The pen moved across paper, ink making commitments that would hold until someone decided they were stronger than the man sitting across from them. That day hadn't come yet in 15 years. Vito intended to keep it that way. The woman's wine arrived. She lifted it carefully, almost ceremonially, like it represented something more than alcohol. A small victory. A moment of control. He watched her inhale before she drank, saw the way her shoulders finally dropped half an inch. Then he saw the man in the gray suit. Vito's instincts sharpened immediately. The blonde man moved through the crowd with purpose, eyes locked on the woman, his posture broadcasting intention that had nothing to do with chance encounters. Water still darkened the shoulders of his jacket. He'd come from outside, recently, which meant he'd followed her here, or tracked her somehow. The woman saw him too. Her entire body went rigid. Vito. Luca's voice registered somewhere distant. The claws about. Handle it. Vito's eyes never left the unfolding scene. Marco, take Luca's recommendations. Whatever he says is fine. Both men exchanged glances, but knew better than to question. When Vito Moretti focused on something, you got out of his way, and thanked God his attention wasn't on you. The blonde man took the seat across from the woman without being invited. Even from across the room, Vito could read the dynamic. She wanted him gone. He was pretending not to notice. Classic control pattern. Ignore her boundaries until she accepted that her boundaries didn't matter. Vito's jaw tightened. He'd seen this play out 1,000 times in 1,000 contexts. Men who mistook persistence for power, who thought wearing someone down was the same as winning. The blonde man ordered a drink. Whiskey, from the color. When it arrived, he settled back like he owned the conversation, like her visible discomfort was just something to overcome with the right words. Vito watched the woman's face. She was listening but not hearing, her attention fractured, survival instincts clearly screaming at her to leave even as something, pride, stubbornness, fear of making a scene, kept her in that chair. Then he saw it. The movement was subtle, practiced. The blonde man's hand dipped into his jacket pocket as he leaned forward, using his body to block the sight line from the main bar. When his hand emerged, it was wrapped around his whiskey glass, but there'd been a moment, barely a heartbeat, when something small and silver had glinted between his fingers. Vito's entire focus narrowed to laser precision. He watched the man's other hand, the one resting near the woman's wine glass. Watched the angle of his shoulders, the calculated timing. The woman stood abruptly, said something Vito couldn't hear, and walked toward the restrooms. The moment she disappeared, the blonde man's hand moved. Quick, efficient, the motion of someone who'd done this before. The silver object, a vial, Vito could see it clearly now, appeared again. The man glanced around casually, checking for witnesses. He didn't look at the corner booth. Didn't see the man in the black suit whose entire body had gone utterly still. The vial tilted over the wine glass. Clear liquid, maybe half a teaspoon, disappearing into the dark red Bordeaux without a trace. The blonde man pocketed the vial, checked his phone like nothing had happened, and settled back with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just executed a plan perfectly. Vito felt the old rage rise, cold and absolute. Not the hot anger of impulse, but the frozen fury of a man who'd made certain promises to himself about certain lines that didn't get crossed. Not in his city. Not in establishments that paid him for protection. Not ever.
Marco.
Luca. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but both men straightened immediately. We're done here. Sign the contracts. Leave them on the table. Is there a problem? Luca's eyes tracked to where Vito was looking. Nothing that concerns you. Vito stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. Anthony. Carlo. His men materialized from their positions around the bar, reading his body language like a text they'd memorized. Anthony moved to the bar's edge, cutting off the main exit. Carlo positioned himself near the corridor to the back offices. Standard formation. The one they used when something needed to be contained quietly. The blonde man finally noticed the shift in atmosphere. His eyes found Vito, registered the focused attention, and his corporate composure cracked just slightly. Fear flickered across his features before he smothered it with false confidence. Vito started walking, each step measured, unhurried. The crowd seemed to sense something and parted without conscious thought, conversations dropping to murmurs. By the time he reached the woman's table, the entire bar had fallen into that particular silence that preceded violence. The blonde man started to stand. Vito raised one finger. A simple gesture. The man sat back down like his legs had been cut from under him. Vito reached for the wine glass, lifted it, held it to the light, examining the liquid with the care of a sommelier, though what he was looking for had nothing to do with vintage or tannins. The faint, almost imperceptible cloudiness near the bottom told him everything he needed to know. The woman emerged from the restroom corridor, confusion and alarm warring on her elegant features as she took in the scene. Her table, her poisoned wine. The man who'd been watching her now holding the evidence of what she hadn't seen coming. Vito's eyes met hers for a brief, electric moment. Then he turned his full attention to the man who'd just made the worst decision of his life. "We need to talk," Vito said quietly. "You and me. About what you just put in this lady's drink." Michelle stared at the glass of red wine Scott had just placed on the polished marmor table between them, the liquid catching the amber light like blood in a crystal vial. Deep red, almost black in the shadows. "Expensive," he'd said. "A peace offering," he'd claimed, his voice still carrying that practiced tremor of remorse that had once made her feel guilty for being angry. "Just one drink, Michelle. For old time's sake. Then I'll leave you alone, I promise." She didn't believe him. Scott's promises had the lifespan of mayflies, beautiful and worthless. But the wine sat there between them, and she could feel the weight of eyes on her back. The investors she needed to impress were somewhere in this bar, and here she was, trapped in a scene with her ex-boyfriend like some desperate reality show contestant who couldn't escape her past. The faster she ended this, the faster she could salvage what remained of her evening and her dignity. Her hand moved toward the glass stem, fingers outstretched. Scott's expression shifted, something flickering behind his corporate mask. Relief? Anticipation? His shoulders relaxed incrementally, the tension in his jaw easing as her fingertips brushed the base of the glass. That's when she felt it. Not a sound, not a movement she could name, but a change in the air itself. Like the moment before lightning strikes, when every hair on your body knows something is coming. Michelle's hand froze, hovering over the wine. Across the room, past the clusters of laughing networking groups and the elegant couple sharing whispered secrets in a corner booth, Vito Moretti had gone completely still. He'd been leaning against the bar, one hand resting casually on the polished wood, the other holding a tumbler of whiskey he'd barely touched. His business associate, a silver-haired man in an immaculate navy suit, had been speaking, gesturing with his hands about something that clearly required emphasis. But Vito wasn't listening anymore. His entire focus had narrowed to a single point across the crowded bar. To Scott's trembling hand. To the glass of wine. To Michelle's extended fingers, inches from disaster. The transformation was subtle, but absolute. The relaxed posture vanished, replaced by something predatory. His jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath his stubble. Those cold, piercing eyes that had been scanning the room with bored authority now burned with a focused intensity that could cut glass. The thick gold chain at his collarbone caught the light as his breathing changed, deeper, controlled, like a fighter preparing to move. He set his whiskey down on the bar with deliberate precision. No rush, no panic. Just the careful movement of a man who had made a decision and would see it through with absolute certainty. Michelle's fingers curled around the wine glass stem. The crystal was cool against her skin, smooth and innocent. Scott leaned back in his chair, that strained smile finally reaching something genuine. Victory. He thought he'd won. Vito pushed away from the bar. The movement was smooth, unhurried, but it carried the inevitability of an avalanche. He navigated through the crowd with the ease of someone who expected people to move for him, and they did, unconsciously stepping aside without understanding why. His gaze never wavered from their table, from Scott's face, from Michelle's hand lifting the glass toward her lips. Michelle raised the wine, the dark liquid swirling gently. She could smell it now, rich and full-bodied with notes of cherry and oak. Something about it seemed off, a chemical undertone she couldn't quite place, but she was already committed to the motion. One sip, one polite acknowledgement of Scott's pathetic gesture, and then she could tell him to leave and never speak to her again. The glass touched her lower lip. Vito was 10 feet away now, moving through a gap between tables. His expression had gone beyond anger into something colder, more dangerous. The kind of fury that didn't need to raise its voice because it knew it had already won. The other men at his previous table had noticed his departure, their conversation dying mid-sentence as they tracked his movement with the wariness of people who understood what that particular walk meant. Scott finally noticed. His eyes widened, tracking something over Michelle's shoulder. The color drained from his face, his corporate composure cracking like thin ice. He started to stand, chair scraping against the floor, but it was already too late. Vito Moretti's shadow fell across their table like a verdict. The wine glass stopped, tilted against Michelle's mouth, but not yet tipping, not yet pouring its poisoned contents down her throat. She didn't understand why she'd frozen, why every instinct was suddenly screaming danger, but her body knew before her mind caught up. Behind her, closer than she'd realized, she heard the quiet, deliberate scrape of an expensive leather shoe against the polished floor. Then nothing. Just the sudden, suffocating weight of absolute silence, spreading through the Belvedere like a held breath. Michelle became aware of the presence behind her the way prey senses a predator. Not through sound or sight, but through some primal understanding that the hierarchy of the room had fundamentally shifted. The expensive perfume and cologne, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of networking conversations, all of it seemed to recede into irrelevance. She still held the wine glass to her lips, frozen mid-sip, when a hand entered her peripheral vision. Not reaching for her, not grabbing the glass, just moving with calm, absolute certainty into the space between her mouth and the poisoned wine. Vito's hand was large, scarred across the knuckles in a way that suggested violence wasn't theoretical to him. He wore a gold signet ring on his right hand, heavy and old-fashioned, the kind that would leave an impression. His movements were precise, as he placed his palm flat on the marble table directly beside her wine glass, close enough that his sleeve brushed the crystal stem. The impact of his hand meeting marble wasn't loud. Just a solid, final sound like a judge's gavel. But it carried through the bar with impossible weight. Michelle's breath caught. She lowered the glass slowly, her hand trembling now, though she couldn't explain why. She'd been about to take a drink. She'd been about to end this awkward encounter and get back to her evening. But something in that simple gesture, that hand on the table, spoke of authority so absolute that disobeying it seemed genuinely dangerous. Vito didn't look at her. His entire focus was on Scott. Scott had gone pale, his corporate composure disintegrating like wet newspaper. Sweat beaded at his hairline, darkening the blonde strands. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, without sound. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd walked into a cage with something that had been waiting, hungry and patient, for exactly this moment. Scott's voice cracked. He tried to stand, chair scraping awkwardly, but his legs seemed uncertain about supporting his weight. Vito still didn't speak. He simply leaned down, his movements controlled and deliberate, until his mouth was inches from Scott's ear. Michelle couldn't hear what he said. She wasn't meant to, but she saw Scott's reaction. The blood drained from his face, so completely, he looked corpse-like. His hands began to shake, actually shake, papers rustling on the table though there was no breeze. A small, Choked sound escaped his throat, something between a whimper and a gasp. Whatever Vito had whispered lasted no more than 5 seconds, but Scott aged years in that span. When Vito straightened, his expression hadn't changed. Still that cold, controlled fury. Still that absolute certainty that he was the most dangerous thing in this room, and everyone knew it. The background music, some smooth jazz that had been playing since Michelle arrived, cut off abruptly. She didn't see who signaled the bartender, but suddenly the absence of music made every other sound sharp and intrusive. The clink of ice in someone's drink. The creak of leather as someone shifted in their seat. The rapid, panicked breathing coming from Scott. Conversations died. Michelle felt it spreading like ripples from their table. People stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths, hands froze on glasses. The entire bar turned its attention toward them, though most pretended otherwise, that particular social skill of watching without appearing to watch. Scott tried to speak again. I wasn't. Vito's hand moved from the table to Scott's shoulder. Not violently. Not even roughly. Just a firm placement of his palm, the way you might steady someone who is about to fall. But the weight of it, the controlled strength in those fingers, made Scott's entire body go rigid. Tears were forming in Scott's eyes now. Actual tears of terror. His expensive gray suit seemed suddenly cheap and ill-fitting, like a costume he'd borrowed to play a part he wasn't qualified for. The nervous energy that had animated him, that jittery confidence of a man executing a careful plan, had evaporated entirely. Michelle finally found her voice. "What's happening?" Vito's eyes shifted to her for the first time, and the intensity of that gaze made her understand why Scott looked like he might vomit. They were light brown, almost amber in the chandelier's glow, but there was nothing warm about them. They assessed her with the clinical precision of someone determining value and threat level simultaneously. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he lifted his other hand, the one not pinning Scott in place, and carefully, almost gently, wrapped his fingers around the wine glass she'd set down. He raised it to his nose, inhaled once, and his expression darkened further, which Michelle hadn't thought possible. Two men she hadn't noticed before, both broad-shouldered and moving with the same controlled efficiency as Vito, appeared at the edges of their table. They wore well-tailored suits that didn't quite hide the bulk of their builds. Security. Muscle. Whatever you wanted to call men whose job was enforcing will through presence and, when necessary, violence. Vito's hand left Scott's shoulder. He stepped back, creating space, but somehow the absence of his touch was more threatening than its presence had been. He made a small gesture with 2 fingers, barely more than a twitch, but the 2 men moved immediately. They flanked Scott, who finally managed to stand on legs that looked ready to collapse. His face was wet now, tears mixing with sweat, his breathing ragged. He looked at Michelle with something like desperation, like she might save him from whatever was about to happen. But Michelle was still trying to understand why her wine glass was now in Vito Moretti's hand, why the entire bar had gone silent, why Scott looked like a man facing execution. Vito spoke for the first time, his voice low and carrying an accent she couldn't quite place. Italian, maybe, softened by years in America, but still present in the vowels. "You should be more careful," he said, still looking at her with those cold, assessing eyes, "about the company you keep." The 2 men moved with practiced efficiency, their hands closing on Scott's elbows with just enough pressure to convey that resistance would be futile and unwise. Scott's mouth opened, perhaps to protest, to explain, to beg, but whatever he saw in their faces killed the words before they could form. Michelle watched, frozen in her chair, as they guided him toward a side exit she hadn't noticed before. Not the main entrance with its glowing neon and valet stand, but a discreet door near the kitchen marked only by a subtle brass plate. Staff exit, probably. Somewhere people could disappear without making a scene. Scott's legs barely seemed to work. He stumbled once, and the man on his right steadied him with the same impersonal efficiency you'd use to right a toppling chair. No emotion. No acknowledgement that this was a human being they were escorting out of the bar, like contaminated waste. The other patrons had begun the delicate social dance of pretending nothing unusual had occurred. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before, with that particular forced quality of people trying too hard to seem normal. Forks clinked against plates. Someone laughed, but it sounded hollow. The jazz music didn't return. Michelle's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the marble table, trying to stop the tremor, but it had spread to her arms, her shoulders, her entire body. The adrenaline that had been building finally crashed over her in waves. What had just happened? Vito still held her wine glass, studying it with the focused attention of a jeweler examining a diamond for flaws. He raised it to the light, tilted it slightly, watching how the liquid moved. Then he brought it to his nose again, inhaling deeply, his expression darkening with each second. He set the glass down on the table with deliberate care, positioning it exactly in the center of where Scott had been sitting, like evidence at a crime scene. When he looked at Michelle again, she couldn't meet his eyes. That intensity was too much, too raw, like staring directly into something that would burn if you held its gaze too long. "Do you know what was in this?" His voice was quiet, meant only for her, but it carried absolute authority. Michelle shook her head. Her throat felt tight, words trapped somewhere between her lungs and her mouth. "Rohypnol." He said the word clinically, without drama.
Just a fact.
"Maybe GHB. Something to make you compliant. To take away your ability to refuse." The implications hit her like a physical blow. The room tilted, her vision tunneling. She'd been seconds away from drinking it. Seconds away from swallowing whatever Scott had put in that glass. Her hand flew to her mouth, bile rising in her throat. "I'm going to be sick."
No.
Vito's hand appeared in her line of sight again, palm up this time, a gesture that was somehow both commanding and oddly gentle.
Breathe. Slowly.
"You didn't drink it." She forced air into her lungs, one breath, then another. The nausea receded slightly, leaving behind a hollow, shaking weakness. Her black dress suddenly felt too tight, the elegant bar too warm, too crowded, too full of people who'd watched this happen and done nothing. Why did he? She couldn't finish the question. Couldn't articulate the betrayal, the calculating cruelty required to drug someone's drink in a public place. Because men like him believe they're entitled to what they want. Vito's expression held no sympathy, but no judgment either. Just cold assessment. And they've learned that if they're careful, they can usually get away with it.
Usually.
The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Not this time. Not here. Not under Vito Moretti's watch. Michelle looked toward the side exit where Scott had disappeared. "What are you going to do to him?" "That's not your concern." Vito straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with the same precise movements he'd used for everything else. The gold chain at his collarbone caught the light, expensive and unmistakably masculine. "Your concern is that you nearly made a very stupid mistake." The words stung, probably because they were true. She'd been about to drink the wine just to end an uncomfortable conversation. Just to be polite. Just to prove she wasn't afraid of Scott anymore. Her people-pleasing instinct had nearly destroyed her. A bartender appeared, moving quickly to remove the wine glass with gloved hands. Michelle noticed the latex only after he'd already wrapped the glass in a white cloth napkin and disappeared toward the back. Evidence being preserved. This wasn't the first time Vito's staff had handled a situation like this. The realization made her stomach clench. What kind of world had she stumbled into? What kind of man noticed a drugged drink from across a crowded bar and intervened with the precision of a military operation? Vito reached into his jacket, pulled out a card, and placed it on the table in front of her. Heavy stock, embossed lettering. Just a name and a phone number. No title. No business affiliation. As if he didn't need to explain who he was. You owe me. His voice had dropped even lower, intimate and dangerous. Not a request. Not a suggestion. A statement of fact that required acknowledgement. Michelle's eyes snapped up to his face. I didn't ask you to. You were about to drink poison that your ex-boyfriend put in your glass. He leaned down slightly, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of cedar and leather. I stopped that from happening. In my world, that creates a debt. I don't have any money. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features, gone so quickly she might have imagined it. I don't want your money, Michelle. Her name in his mouth sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. She hadn't told him her name, which meant he already knew who she was. Had known before he crossed the room. Before he stopped her from drinking. He'd been watching her specifically, not just observing the bar in general. Then what do you want? Vito didn't answer immediately. He studied her with those cold amber eyes, calculating something she couldn't begin to guess. Whatever equation he was running in his head, she was apparently a variable that required careful consideration. I'll let you know. He stepped back, creating distance, already dismissing her from his attention. Don't leave the city. And Michelle? He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Next time someone offers you a drink you didn't watch being made, be smarter. Then he was gone, moving back toward his booth where his silver-haired associate waited with the patience of someone accustomed to their boss's interruptions. Michelle didn't remember calling the Uber or giving her address. The ride home passed in a blur of streetlights and rain-slicked windows, her reflection ghostly and unfamiliar in the glass. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but the tremor had moved inward, settling somewhere deep in her chest where it pulsed with each heartbeat. The driver tried to make conversation once, something about the weather, but whatever he saw in her face when she met his eyes in the rearview mirror made him go silent for the rest of the trip. Her apartment building looked exactly as it had when she'd left 3 hours ago, but Michelle felt like she'd returned from a different country, different world. One where men drugged wine glasses in upscale bars and other men stopped them with the casual authority of people who dealt in violence as a profession. She climbed the 4 flights to her studio, her heels clicking against worn linoleum, and locked 3 separate deadbolts behind her. The sound of each lock sliding home should have made her feel safer. It didn't. Her black dress came off first, discarded in a heap on the bathroom floor like it carried contamination. She stood under the shower until the water ran cold, scrubbing at skin that felt crawling and wrong, trying to wash away the memory of how close she'd come to disaster. By the time she emerged, wrapped in her oldest, softest robe, she'd almost convinced herself it was over. Scott was gone, handled by whatever machinery Vito Moretti had at his disposal. She'd never have to see either of them again. She could focus on Monday's interview, on rebuilding her business, on the life she'd been trying to construct from the wreckage Scott had left behind. The card Vito had given her sat on her kitchen counter, where she'd emptied her purse. Heavy cream stock with raised lettering. Just a name and number, no other information. She picked it up, studied it for a long moment, then tore it in half. Then quarters. Then smaller pieces still, feeding them into her trash can with grim satisfaction.
There. Done.
Whatever debt Vito thought she owed him could remain uncollected. She hadn't asked for his help. Hadn't wanted his intervention or his protection or whatever narrative he'd constructed around playing hero. She owed him nothing. She repeated this to herself as she made chamomile tea she wouldn't drink. as she tried to read design blogs and couldn't focus past the first paragraph. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling while her alarm clock ticked toward midnight. Sleep came eventually, fitful and full of dreams about wine glasses and amber eyes and hands that stopped her from drinking poison she couldn't see. The knock on her door came at 7 the next morning. Michelle jerked awake, heart hammering. She never got deliveries this early. Never got deliveries at all, really, except the occasional package her mother sent with care instructions she'd stopped reading. She checked the peephole. Empty hallway. But when she unlocked the deadbolts and opened the door a crack, something sat on her welcome mat. A box. Black, unmarked, about the size of a shoebox. Expensive looking, with that matte finish that suggested custom ordering rather than retail purchase. Michelle looked left, then right down the hallway. No one. Just Mrs. Chen's door across the hall, firmly closed, and the sound of morning television bleeding through thin walls. She shouldn't take it inside. Every instinct screamed that accepting this package, whatever it contained, would be a mistake. But curiosity and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like inevitability, made her bend down and pick it up. It was heavier than expected. Not dramatically so, but with the weighted feel of something carefully packed. No shipping label. No return address. Just her name written on top in elegant script, Michelle. She brought it inside, locked the door again, and set it on her small dining table. Stared at it while her coffee brewed. While she dressed. While she tried to convince herself that opening it was optional. It wasn't optional. She knew that. Had known it the moment she saw her name in that careful handwriting. The box opened easily, no tape or seals to break through. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a tablet. New, expensive, the kind she couldn't afford in her current financial situation. A small envelope rested on top, sealed with actual wax. Red wax, pressed with some kind of signet. Old-fashioned and deliberately theatrical. Michelle's hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the heavy cardstock inside. The note was brief, written in the same elegant script as her name on the box. The tablet contains what you need to understand your situation. Watch it. Then be at IL Corridor, 1247 Merchant Street, tomorrow at 8 p.m. Come alone. Don't be late. The debt stands. No signature. None needed. Michelle set the note down and picked up the tablet. It powered on immediately, already charged, already configured. A single video file sat on the otherwise empty desktop, time-stamped from the previous night. She pressed play. The footage was high quality, the kind of security camera video that costs serious money. It showed the Belvedere's bar from an elevated angle, capturing the entire main room. She could see herself at her table, elegant in her black dress, phone in hand. Could see the moment Scott entered, tracked his movement across the floor, watched him approach her table. The timestamp in the corner advanced. Scott ordered drinks from a passing server. 2 glasses appeared. 1 bourbon for him. 1 red wine that he requested specifically. The camera angle shifted. A second video file had been spliced in, this one from a different position. Lower. Closer. It showed Scott's hands as he waited for the drinks, one hand in his jacket pocket, emerging with something small and silver. A vial, maybe, or a tiny bottle. His movements were practiced, efficient. He'd done this before. The server placed the drinks on his tray and turned away. Scott's hand moved with casual precision, tilting the small container over the wine glass for just a moment. The email arrived at 9:47 a.m., 16 hours before Michelle was supposed to meet Vito at IL Corridor. She'd been staring at her laptop for the better part of an hour, pretending to review her portfolio for Monday's interview while actually spiraling through every possible scenario of what tomorrow night might bring. The chime of new mail made her jump, coffee sloshing dangerously close to her keyboard. The sender was listed as Castellano Capital Partners. She didn't recognize the name, but the subject line made her breath catch. Investment proposal, Hartwell Designs. Hartwell Designs. Her business. The jewelry company she'd been trying to save for 8 months, ever since Scott had systematically destroyed her credit and scared off her previous investors with his interference. The company that existed now mostly on paper and hope, with a handful of custom pieces she'd sold to friends and 3 small boutiques that had taken her work on consignment. She hadn't sent an investment proposal to anyone named Castellano. Michelle opened the email with trembling fingers. Ms. Hartwell, we've reviewed your business model and design portfolio with great interest. Castellano Capital Partners specializes in supporting emerging artists and designers with exceptional potential, and we believe Hartwell Designs represents exactly the kind of vision we seek to cultivate. We would like to offer an initial investment of $250,000 with the following terms. 15% equity stake, non-voting shares, no repayment schedule or interest, quarterly review meetings, location flexible, first right of refusal on future funding rounds, no board seat or operational control. Additionally, we can provide immediate credit rehabilitation services through our partner financial institutions, as we understand previous circumstances have complicated your access to traditional funding. If these terms are acceptable, we can finalize paperwork by end of business Friday. Wire transfer would process Monday morning. Please confirm your interest at your earliest convenience. Regards, Thomas Castellano, Managing Partner. Michelle read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The terms were impossible. Investors didn't offer $250,000 for 15% equity with no control, no repayment terms, no strings attached. Especially not to a failing jewelry designer with ruined credit and no proven market presence. And credit rehabilitation services? That was specific. Targeted. Someone knew exactly what Scott had done to her finances. Her hands were shaking again as she searched for Castellano Capital Partners. The website was professionally designed, sleek and minimal, showcasing a portfolio of small businesses and artists they'd allegedly funded. Restaurants, galleries, boutique hotels. All successful. All operating in the same general area of the city. The same area where the Belvedere was located. Where IL Corridor was located. She clicked through to the leadership page. Thomas Castellano's photo showed a silver-haired man in his 60s, distinguished and professionally styled. His bio listed an impressive education and decades of experience in venture capital and private equity. Michelle stared at his face, and recognition hit like ice water. The silver-haired man from Vito's booth. The one who'd been talking to him when Vito noticed Scott drugging her wine. The man who'd waited patiently while Vito crossed the bar to intervene, as if he'd expected the interruption and knew better than to object.
No.
She said it aloud to her empty apartment. No, no, no. But even as she said it, she was calculating. $250,000 would save her business. Would let her hire proper help, invest in materials, rent actual studio space instead of working from her cramped apartment. Would give her the freedom to create without the constant suffocating pressure of debt and Scott's sabotage following her like a shadow. Would put her completely in Vito Moretti's pocket. Because this wasn't a legitimate investment opportunity. This was a leash. Elegant, expensive, disguised as generosity, but a leash nonetheless. 15% equity meant he'd own part of her company. Quarterly review meetings meant regular check-ins where she'd have to answer to him. First right of refusal meant he could control her growth indefinitely. And the credit rehabilitation? That was the clearest message of all. He knew everything about her situation. Had investigated her finances, her history with Scott, probably her entire life. had identified exactly what she needed and was offering it with terms too good to refuse.
Her phone rang.
Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her swipe to accept. Ms. Hartwell. Thomas Castellano's voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent that matched Vito's. I hope you received our proposal. I did. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. This is very sudden. Opportunity often is. A pause. I imagine you have questions about how we learned of your work. Among other things. Let's simply say we have mutual acquaintances who speak very highly of your talent. The terms are genuine, Ms. Hartwell. No hidden clauses. No unexpected demands. We believe in supporting artists who show promise. Artists who owe Vito Moretti a debt, Michelle thought but didn't say. I need time to think about it. Of course. Though I would encourage you to consider that offers of this nature are rarely extended twice. His tone remained pleasant, but the underlying message was clear. Accept now, or lose the opportunity entirely. Perhaps tomorrow evening's meeting would be an appropriate time to discuss your decision.
So he knew about that too.
Of course he did. I haven't decided if I'm attending that meeting. Castellano's laugh was quiet, almost paternal. Ms. Hartwell, you're an intelligent woman. I think we both know you'll attend. The question is whether you'll arrive ready to move forward or determined to remain trapped in circumstances that serve no one. The line went dead before she could respond. Michelle sat motionless, phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the silence. Around her, the apartment that had felt like a sanctuary an hour ago now seemed shabby and confining. The half-finished jewelry pieces on her work table, the bills stacked on her counter, the rejection letters from galleries and investors she'd carefully filed away, all of it suddenly felt like evidence of a life she'd been failing to build on her own terms. Vito was offering her way out, was dangling financial freedom and professional success in front of her like bait, knowing she was desperate enough to take it despite understanding the trap. The worst part was that he was right. She pulled up her banking app, stared at the balance that had been hovering near zero for months, looked at the credit card statements she'd been dodging, the collections notices, the constant grinding anxiety of trying to build something beautiful while drowning in debt Scott had created. $250,000 would change everything. It would also chain her to a man who collected debts and expected repayment in forms she couldn't begin to predict. Michelle closed her laptop, walked to her window, and stared out at the gray morning. Somewhere in this city, Vito Moretti was already several steps ahead of her, moving pieces on a board she hadn't known she was playing on, orchestrating her future with the same calm precision he'd used to stop her from drinking poison wine. Saving her, controlling her. The two were becoming impossible to separate. Her phone buzzed with another email. The investment contract, already drawn up, waiting only for her signature. She had until tomorrow night at 8 p.m. to decide if she was going to sign away 15% of her company and an unknown amount of her autonomy to a man who'd made it clear that debts, in his world, were not optional. Michelle looked at her reflection in the window glass.
Pale.
Frightened. But underneath that, something else was beginning to surface. Anger, maybe. Or resignation. Or the grim understanding that sometimes survival meant making deals with dangerous people and hoping you were smart enough to come out the other side intact. She had 22 hours to decide who she wanted to be. The woman who stayed trapped in debt and failure, clinging to independence she couldn't afford. Or the woman who walked into IL Corridor and negotiated the terms of her surrender. IL Corridor occupied a narrow building on Merchant Street that Michelle walked past twice before finding the entrance. No sign. No menu posted in the window. Just a heavy wooden door with a brass number plate and a single doorbell. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. The same black dress from the Belvedere felt wrong, tainted by association, so she'd selected a charcoal silk blouse and tailored black pants. Professional. Serious. The kind of armor you wore when negotiating with someone who already held all the leverage. The investment contract sat and signed in her bag, printed and reviewed so many times she'd memorized every clause. Michelle pressed the doorbell at exactly 8 p.m. The door opened immediately, as if someone had been watching her approach. A woman in her 40s, elegant in a simple black suit, gestured her inside without speaking. The interior was dimly lit, all dark wood and wine-red accents, with perhaps 6 tables total. Only one was occupied. Vito sat alone at a corner table, positioned so he could see both the entrance and the kitchen door. He'd traded the black suit from the Belvedere for charcoal gray, but the gold chain remained, glinting against his white shirt. A bottle of red wine sat unopened on the table beside 2 glasses. He didn't stand as she approached. Didn't offer pleasantries or small talk. Just watched her with those cold amber eyes as she sat across from him, her bag placed carefully on the chair beside her. "You came." His voice carried the faintest hint of satisfaction, as if her attendance had been in question despite his certainty. "You didn't leave me much choice." "There's always a choice, Michelle." He poured wine into both glasses with practiced ease, the liquid catching the candlelight. "You could have ignored the package, torn up the investment offer, stayed home tonight. And then what?" A slight smile touched his mouth, cold and knowing. "And then you would have learned that debts don't disappear simply because you find them inconvenient." Michelle left her wine glass untouched. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Vito noticed, and that smile deepened fractionally. "It's not drugged. I don't operate that way." "You operate by manipulating people's circumstances until they have no option but to comply." "I prefer to think of it as creating opportunities." He leaned back in his chair, that relaxed posture that somehow emphasized rather than diminished his physical presence. "Tell me, did you review the investment terms?" 15% equity for $250,000. No operational control. It's generous to the point of being suspicious. Smart girl. He took a sip of his wine, studying her over the rim. Most people would simply accept and ask questions later. But you've done your research. You know Thomas Castellano was at the Belvedere. You understand this isn't a coincidence. "What do you want from me?" Vito set his glass down with deliberate precision. "Your jewelry design skills are exceptional. I've seen your portfolio. The custom pieces you create show remarkable attention to detail and an understanding of both aesthetic beauty and structural integrity." Michelle's stomach tightened. "I make necklaces and earrings for boutiques. Nothing that would interest someone in your position." "My position." He repeated the words softly, almost amused. "You're dancing around what you think I am. Say it." She met his eyes, refusing to look away despite the intensity there. "You're involved in organized crime. The way you handled Scott, the security detail, the resources at your disposal. This isn't legitimate business." "No, it's not." His bluntness was somehow more unsettling than denial would have been. "And I need a jewelry designer who can create very specific pieces. Items that serve purposes beyond decoration. Do you understand what I'm asking?" The implications settled over her like ice water. Jewelry that served other purposes. Hidden compartments. Ways to transport or conceal things that needed transporting or concealing. Her skills bent toward a legal lens. "I'm not a criminal. You're a woman who owes me a debt and needs money desperately enough to consider accepting investment from a source you know is compromised." Vito's tone remained even, factual. "Your moral high ground is a luxury you can't currently afford." "There are lines I won't cross." Everyone says that until they discover where their lines actually fall. He leaned forward slightly, and the shift in his posture changed the entire energy of the conversation. More focused, more predatory. I'm offering you financial freedom, a chance to build your business without debt, without Scott's sabotage, without the constant fear of failure. In exchange, you'll design specific pieces for specific clients. Nothing that will trace back to you. Nothing that will endanger you. Just make me complicit in whatever you're involved in. Complicit. Employed.
Protected.
Choose whichever term helps you sleep at night. His eyes held hers, unblinking. But understand this clearly. I saved your life at the Belvedere. That creates a bond whether you acknowledge it or not. You can work with me willingly and prosper, or you can fight this and discover that the debt compounds. The threat wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. Michelle thought about her empty bank account, the collections notices, the slow death of dreams she'd nurtured since college. Thought about Scott, who'd faced consequences for the first time in his life because Vito had decided to intervene. What kind of pieces? Her voice came out quieter than intended. Vito's expression shifted, something like approval flickering across his features. Custom work. High-end materials. Occasionally with modifications that allow for concealment. Small compartments, false stones, mechanisms that aren't immediately obvious. Nothing that compromises the aesthetic quality. That's illegal. Yes. The single word hung between them, stark and honest. He wasn't trying to convince her it was anything other than what it was. Wasn't dressing it up in euphemisms or justifications. Just offering her a clear-eyed view of exactly what he expected. Michelle's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the table. And if I refuse? Then you refuse. Vito took another sip of wine, completely relaxed. The investment offer disappears. Your credit remains destroyed. And you continue struggling alone, wondering when Scott or someone like him will try again. Because men like that don't stop, Michelle. They escalate. And next time, I might not be there to intervene. The calculation was brutal and effective. He was offering protection alongside the money. Safety in exchange for compromise. Her principles weighed against her survival. How often would you need pieces? Variable. Some months, nothing. Others, perhaps 2 or 3 commissions. You have creative control over the design within specified parameters. Payment would be generous, deposited into accounts that can't be traced back to my operations. This would make me a criminal. This would make you mine. The possessive pronoun carried weight that had nothing to do with business. His gaze traveled over her deliberately, assessing not just her skills but her as a whole. You'd be under my protection. Part of my organization. No one would touch you. No one would threaten you. Your business would thrive because I'd ensure it thrived. The sexual tension that had been simmering beneath their conversation suddenly blazed into explicit territory. The way he looked at her wasn't professional, wasn't distant. It was the focused attention of a man who decided what he wanted and was accustomed to acquiring it. Michelle's breath caught. I'm not sleeping with you. I didn't ask you to. But his slight smile suggested the possibility remained open, filed away for future consideration. Though if that changes, you'll be the one to initiate it. I don't take. I offer and people choose. The distinction felt important to him, she realized. A line he drew that separated him from men like Scott. Choice, even when that choice was constrained by circumstance and desperation, mattered in his moral framework. I need time to think.
No.
Vito's tone hardened. You've had time. The contract is in your bag. Sign it now, or walk away and don't come back. Michelle pulled out the investment agreement with trembling hands. The pen he slid across the table was heavy, expensive, probably worth more than her monthly rent. She thought about her apartment, her failing business, her ruined credit. Thought about Scott's face as he drugged her wine, about how close she'd come to a nightmare she'd never have woken from. Thought about Vito's intervention, swift and absolute, and what it meant that a man like him had decided she was worth saving. The pen touched paper. Her signature flowed across the designated line, elegant and damning in equal measure. Vito took the contract, folded it precisely, and placed it in his jacket pocket.
Good.
Thomas will wire the funds Monday morning. I'll have specifications for your first commission delivered by Wednesday. He stood, and Michelle realized the meeting was over. She'd sold herself, and the transaction had taken less than 30 minutes. Michelle. He said her name like a claim. Welcome to the family. The wire transfer hit Michelle's account at 9:03 a.m. Monday morning, exactly as Thomas Castellano had promised. She stared at her phone screen, watching the balance refresh from $372 to $250,372. The number didn't look real, didn't feel real. But the email from her credit monitoring service that arrived 20 minutes later was undeniably real. 3 major derogatory marks removed. Collections accounts settled in full. Her credit score had jumped 140 points overnight. Vito Moretti moved fast when he wanted something accomplished. Michelle sat at her cramped work table, surrounded by half-finished designs and supplies she'd been rationing for months, and felt the future shift beneath her like tectonic plates rearranging. She could rent proper studio space now. Could order materials without checking her account balance first. Could hire an assistant, invest in marketing, reach out to galleries that had rejected her before. Could build the business she'd dreamed about since college, when jewelry design had felt like art instead of survival. The cost was her complicity in crimes she didn't want to examine too closely. The price was her autonomy, purchased by a man who collected debts and expected loyalty in forms that couldn't be negotiated. But she was breathing, was safe, wasn't checking over her shoulder for Scott or living in terror of the collection's calls that had become white noise in her life, that had to count for something. The first commission arrived Wednesday in an unmarked package, delivered by the same elegant woman who'd opened the door at IL Corridor. Inside, she found detailed specifications, reference photos, and a note in Vito's precise handwriting. High-quality emerald pendant. Hidden compartment beneath the stone, accessible via pressure mechanism. Must withstand casual inspection. Budget, unlimited. Timeline, 2 weeks. Also in the package, raw materials worth more than she'd spent on supplies in the last year. A flawless 3-carat emerald. Platinum wire. Tools she'd coveted but never been able to afford. Michelle spread everything across her work table and felt something unexpected. Excitement. The challenge was complex, requiring her to blend aesthetic beauty with functional engineering. It was the kind of problem that made her fingers itch to start sketching. She worked for 6 hours straight, losing herself in the design process the way she hadn't been able to in months. When she finally looked up, dusk had fallen, and her first draft sat complete on the table. Elegant. Sophisticated. Completely innocent-looking except for the subtle pressure point that would release the hidden compartment. She was good at this. Better than good. And Vito had known it. The studio space she rented the following week occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the Arts District. Exposed brick, floor-to-ceiling windows, enough room to work without feeling cramped. Her landlord didn't ask questions about how a struggling designer could suddenly afford the deposit. Didn't comment on the security system that was installed the same day she signed the lease, far more sophisticated than the building warranted. Michelle understood. She was protected now. An asset worth safeguarding. The second commission came before she'd finished the first. Then a third. Vito's specifications were always precise, always challenging, always pushed her skills in new directions. She found herself working late into the night, not from desperation now, but from genuine creative engagement. Her legitimate business flourished alongside the illegal work. Gallery owners who'd ignored her emails suddenly returned her calls. Boutiques that had dropped her work picked it up again. Michelle recognized Vito's influence in some of these changes, but not all. Some of it was simply that she had resources now, could present herself professionally, could afford to take risks on bold designs. She hired an assistant, rented booth space at a prestigious craft fair, pitched to clients she'd never dreamed of approaching before. She was becoming successful, and every piece of legitimate work was built on a foundation of crimes she committed in private, designing jewelry that concealed things she never asked about. The cognitive dissonance should have destroyed her. Instead, she found herself adapting with a speed that would have terrified the woman who'd walked into the Belvedere 6 weeks ago. That woman had been Scott's victim, defined by his cruelty and her own inability to escape. This woman was something different, something harder, protected by a dangerous man and complicit in his operations, but free in ways she'd never been when she'd tried to maintain her independence through poverty and struggle. The package arrived on a Friday evening, delivered by Vito's driver rather than the elegant woman. Inside was a velvet box, expensive and weighted with significance. Michelle opened it slowly. The necklace was extraordinary. White gold chain, delicate but strong, supporting a pendant that took her breath away. A black diamond surrounded by smaller white diamonds in a setting so intricate it must have taken weeks to create. The craftsmanship was exceptional, museum-quality work that spoke of an artist at the peak of their abilities. A note lay beneath the jewelry box, Vito's handwriting as precise as ever. For the woman who understands that freedom and safety are never free. Wear this tomorrow night. Dinner at IL Corridor, 8 p.m. We have much to discuss. Michelle lifted the necklace from its box, feeling the weight of it in her palm. The black diamond caught the light, mysterious and beautiful and undeniably powerful. A marker of status. A claim of ownership. A symbol of exactly who and what she'd become. She fastened it around her neck, the cool metal settling against her skin like an inevitability. Her reflection in the mirror showed someone she barely recognized. Elegant.
Composed.
Dangerous in her own right now, because danger protected her. No longer Michelle Hartwell, struggling designer and Scott's victim. Now Michelle Hartwell, jeweler to an empire built on violence and control. Protected. Prosperous. Compromised beyond redemption. She touched the black diamond at her throat, feeling its weight, its beauty, its damning significance. Tomorrow night she would sit across from Vito Moretti and discuss whatever he wanted to discuss. Would accept whatever new commission he required. Would continue building her business on a foundation that would destroy her if anyone looked too closely. But tonight, alone in her new studio with her successful designs surrounding her and the necklace marking her as his, Michelle allowed herself a moment of brutal honesty. She wasn't sorry. The woman who'd almost drunk poison wine had been powerless, drowning, clinging to principles she couldn't afford. This woman had agency, even if that agency was constrained by invisible chains more sophisticated than any prison. She'd made a deal with a devil who wore expensive suits and gold chains, who'd save her life and then purchased her loyalty with money and protection she'd been desperate enough to accept. And somewhere in the transaction, she'd stopped being a victim and become something else entirely. Michelle turned away from her reflection, the black diamond heavy and constant against her throat. Tomorrow she would wear it to dinner and accept whatever came next. Would continue designing beautiful things that served dark purposes. Would prosper under the protection of a man who dealt in violence as casually as other men dealt in spreadsheets. The path she'd chosen was dangerous. morally compromised, built on foundations that wouldn't survive scrutiny. But it was hers. For the first time since Scott had destroyed her credit and her confidence, Michelle's life belonged to her. Even if she'd had to sell part of her soul to a crime boss to reclaim it. She touched the necklace one more time, feeling its weight settle into place. Her crown, her chain, her new identity. The queen of a dark empire she hadn't known existed 6 weeks ago, wearing jewelry that marked her as protected, valuable, and completely, irrevocably his. Michelle smiled at her reflection, and the woman who smiled back was no one's victim anymore.